What's up, everyone? I'm Christian Whitlow, coming to you from VA on Fed by Fire, the podcast where we burn through the bullshit to get to the raw truth about crime, corruption, and the systems that let monsters thrive in today's society. And today we're diving headfirst into one of the biggest bombshells to drop in history. The Jeffrey Epstein file dump that was released just a couple days ago on January 30th, 2026 by the U.S. Department of Justice. This is over 3 million pages, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images straight from their investigative vault. And we're talking emails, text, internal reports, photos, the works. And yeah, it's the final batch. Under the Epstein files, Transparency Act, EFTA, but let's be real, folks, this story is far from over. If you've been following this at all or my channel, you know we've touched on the Epstein files a lot and his ties to power, player, and the island of whores, the suit, the S word in jail. But this dump, it's a game changer, and we're going to go deep into it today. This is going to be a pretty good breakdown, and I'll walk you through the background, the key revelations, the names popping up from Trump to Musk to royals, the redactions, and what it means for justice or lack thereof. So grab your coffee and settle in, because we're exposing everything we've learned. It's going to be no holds bars. And yeah, I'm just happy to be here with you guys and just grateful for all the love and support. But let's get into it. Let's talk about the Epstein empire. Let's start with the basics. For anyone who's been living under a rock and is new to this nightmare, Jeffrey Epstein was a billionaire financier who built his fortune through shady deals, rubbing elbows with elites. But behind the yachts, behind the mansions, a sex trafficking ring targeted underage girls, recruited, groomed, and abused them, often on his private jet, the Lolita Express, or the St. James Island. Epstein got pinched in 2008 in Florida, though, on state charges, and he scored one of the most sweetheart deals in history thanks to his connections like Alex Acosta, who later became Trump's labor secretary. And, he served a joke of a sentence and kept from operating. But you fast forward to 2019 and the charges in New York for sex trafficking. And then he dies by it. The S word in jail. Yeah, right. And his accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, she got convicted in 2021. Why the files now? Congress passed the EFTA Act in late 2025, forcing the DOJ to release everything. No more hiding behind national security or whatever. But, they missed that deadline. So, dropping this monster batch a month late on January 30th, Deputy AG Todd Blanche held a presser saying, it's all out there now. 3 million pages total across releases, with this being one of the biggest he emphasized. Redactions to protect victims' info. Fair enough, but also shot down wild claims like unfounded accusations against Trump from pre-2020 tips from what we've dug through. And trust me, I've been scrolling these PDFs nonstop. It's a mix of FBI tips, emails, news clippings, investigative memos. Some ex-users are already building searchable databases. Shout out to the folks like Alan Analius for making it easier. But the DOJ site, it's going to be clunky as hell with age verification and no good search. So I'm just putting that out there. But let's talk about the big names and who's in the crosshairs. This is where it gets juicy and infuriating at the same time. These files packed with comms between Epstein and the who's who of power. So let's break it down, y'all. Of course, we heard old Donald Trump was in there with multiple mentions, including FBI tips about parties in the early 2000s and flights on Epstein's jet. But Blanche was quick to say the DOJ didn't protect Trump, meaning that no social treatment and some claims like 2020 election error smears are basically bogus. But still, the photos, the emails, they all show ties, though nothing new enough for prosecutions per Blanche, but Bill Clinton references galore, flights, island visits, you name it, he was there. The files revisit old scandals with emails and statements tying him closer than ever. No bombshells on crimes, but, it paints a picture of Epstein using Clinton's name for leverage. Elon Musk emails with Epstein on various topics, including tech and finance, but he was a guy's guy. One standout comms was Steve Bannon and Musk about power players. Musk denied deep ties, but these docs show ongoing chats post-2008. Howard Lutnick, Trump's Commerce Secretary, had a big reveal. Emails show he planned a 2012 lunch on Epstein's island years after claiming to cut ties with him. That's post-conviction, folks, but Lutnick's team says it was business, no funny stuff, but the optics, terrible. Let's talk about Prince Andrew. New pics apparently showing him compromising spots. The files detail settlements and denials, but victim statements hammer home the allegations. Britain's calling for accountability. And then there's Bill Gates, Steve Tisch, NFL co-owner, and others. Gates' emails on philanthropy, yeah, sure. Tisch on investments, even a mention of an email involving Modi and India's PM, plus wilder claims like cannibalism and witness tips unverified. But chilling Democrats like Jamie Raskin are pushing for an urgent review, saying that the DOJ's only released half of the 6 million pages that they identified, and internationally, Slovakia's got a resignation over ties, and the BBC's digging into Andrew on X users, and they are going nuts. And they're calling it a system, not just one guy. And the highlights even, show mentions of files of fraud, polls, targeting, and it's just a really, really eye-opening thing, but this could change everything, you guys. So let's talk about the media, the images, and what they show. So the real gut punch, those 2,000 videos and 180,000 images, not all explicit. Thank God for redactions, but enough to haunt you. We're talking surveillance footage from the island, party pics, jet logs visualized, key takeaways, photos of elites gathering, and, nothing prosecutable per DOJ, but damning socially. Videos of interviews with victims blurred for privacy, detailing grooming tactics, internal DOJ clips debating redactions. Meta as hell, but wild stuff. Old Trump party clips, and Andrew and group shots, even torture claims and tips. But Blanche says it's not enough for new charges, but critics argue why not. Is this closure or cover up? The PBS notes that heavy redactions hide as much as they reveal. And, that says a lot for itself, that there's screenshots of, CP and horrifying R-word claims, and that's disgusting. But, Trump mentioned directly, but let's talk about the aftermath, conspiracies, and what's next. So, what have we learned? Epstein wasn't solo. He was the hub of a web protecting the powerful. No major arrests from this dump yet, but public pleasures mounting. They note it like it fulfills the EFTA, and Dems want more. Conspiracies, why delay the White House oversight denials? And globally, Modi to Australian PMs, it shows Epstein's reach was worldwide. So my take is this exposes how money and power corrupt victims. And the victims, how they corrupt people. And the victims deserve justice. That's all I'm going to say about this. Next, let's talk about what's going on in the sanctuary cities and how the federal government is talking about cutting off their funding and all that. So, there's a lot of noise around this topic, a lot of emotion, and a lot of misinformation. So, let's, slow down and walk through it. I just wanted to get into it about what sanctuary cities are and what the federal government is threatening to do and what has already basically happened in the past and what the law actually allows and what this could realistically mean moving forward, because, there is a massive difference between political rhetoric and legal reality. But let's start with the basics here. When people hear the phrase sanctuary city, many assume that means a city that ignores federal law or harbors criminals, but that's not what it actually means. A sanctuary city is a city or local government that limits how much it cooperates with federal immigration enforcement, and that usually means that local police are not required to ask about immigration status. It also can mean they don't harbor certain ICE detainers requests unless there is a judicial warrant. So, the reasoning behind these policies is rooted in community policing, that the idea is that if undocumented immigrants fear deportation every time they interact with police, they are less likely to report crimes, cooperate as witnesses, or seek help in general. And supporters say that this makes communities safer, but opponents say it obstructs immigration enforcement and allows dangerous individuals to avoid deportation. That debate has been going on for decades, but the funding fight is where things get serious. And we're going to be talking about all that. So now let's talk about what's happening right now. The current administration has announced that federal funding to sanctuary cities and even to states that contain certain sanctuary jurisdictions will be cut off, and that the message is pretty simple. If you don't cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, you don't get federal money. That simple. That announcement alone has sent shockwaves through major cities, because we're not talking about small grants. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars nationwide. So this is a big deal, y'all. Money that funds transportation, public safety, emergency management, housing, healthcare, education, and social services. So naturally, cities and states are pushing back hard. But, here's the key point. And, the announcement is not the same thing as a lawful action. So let's get that straight. And this is where history really matters, y'all. This is not the first time a president has tried this. Not even close. During Trump's first term, an executive order attempted to withhold federal grants from sanctuary jurisdictions. So this isn't his first rodeo, and that order immediately was challenged in court. And courts across the country straight up blocked it. Judges ruled that executive branch does not have the authority to unliterally cut off federal funds, and that were appropriated by Congress. In simple terms, the president cannot decide on their own to punish cities financially for policy disagreements, but that power belongs to Congress. And those rulings were not narrow, so they were broad and they were clear. Fast forward to now, we are seeing the same playbook exactly. New executive orders, new threats, the same constitutional limits, though. And once again, cities are suing. So what is the legal agreement here? Why do the courts keep blocking these funding cuts? It comes down to three main principles. First, spending clause of the Constitution. That's the first one. Congress controls federal spending, not the president. So, federal money comes with conditions, yes, but those conditions must be clearly written into the law by Congress. So, the executive branch cannot, just invent new conditions after the fact. Second, the 10th Amendment, the federal government cannot force states or cities to enforce federal law. That's called anti-commandering. But local governments cannot be coerced into becoming immigration agents, Third, coercion. The Supreme Court, has ruled that the federal government cannot use funding as a financial gun to the head. You cannot threaten to destroy a city's budget unless it adopts a specific policy. And, that crosses the line from encouragement into unconstitutional coercion. And courts have consistently said these funding threats cross that line. Now, let's talk about what funding is actually at stake, y'all. This is where a lot of people misunderstand the issue, is when politicians say we'll cut off federal funding, people imagine one specific pot of money, and that's not how it works. But cities receive federal dollars through dozens of programs, and Justice Department grants, Homeland Security grants, transportation funding, emergency preparedness, public health initiatives, housing assistance, education support. And in many major cities, federal funding accounts for a significant percentage of their annual budget. So, cutting that funding wouldn't just affect immigration policy, it would affect roads, hospitals, public transit, stuff people all rely on, schools, first responders, which is why courts have been especially skeptical on blanket funding threats. Another important point I want to make is even now, despite the announcements of federal funding, has not been, it hasn't been universally cut off. Some grants have been delayed or reviewed. Some funds have been paused temporarily. But, broad sweeping defunding has not happened yet. But why? Because the administration knows what happens next. That immediate lawsuits, emergency injunctions, all that good stuff, and likely court orders blocking the action. And that's exactly what has happened before. And it's already happening again. So, there's that. So here's, the distinction everyone needs to understand. There is political power and there is legal power. Politically, a president can make bold announcements. They can threaten, they can campaign on enforcement. They can pressure cities publicly if that's what they want to do. But legally, however, they are constrained. Without Congress passing a law explicitly conditioning funds on immigration cooperation, the executive branch is on shaky ground. And so far, Congress has not passed such a law. Bills have been introduced, though. They've been debated, but they have not become law. and that matters a lot. Now, let's talk about the state angle here. One of the newer developments is the threat to cut funding not just to cities but to entire states if any city within them has sanctuary city policies. That's a major escalation, and it raises even more constitutional issues because now you're punishing entire populations, including jurisdictions that fully cooperate with immigration enforcement for the actions of others. And that kind of collective punishment is almost guaranteed to be challenged in court, and based on, precedent, it's very likely to be blocked. Supporters of the funding cuts argue that this is about enforcing the rule of law, and they say that federal immigration law is being, undermined. And they say that taxpayer money, should not go to jurisdictions that refuse to cooperate. And opponents, they argue that this is about federal overreach more than anything. They say it undermines local control. They say that it harms public safety by making communities afraid to engage with law enforcement in general. But both sides frame this as a public safety issue. But again, the courts don't rule on feelings, y'all. They rule on law. And legally, this remains a steep uphill battle for the administration, obviously. So, what happens next? Realistically, more lawsuits, more injunctions, and more delays. That's what we can expect. This issue could wind its way through the courts for years, possibly even to the next Supreme Court, unless Congress acts the executive branch's ability to enforce these funding threats. And, it remains limited. And that's not opinion, y'all. That's constitutional structure. And here's the bigger picture. This fight isn't just about immigration. It's about federalism. It's about the balance of power. It's about whether a president can financially strong-arm cities into compliance. That's what we're going to see here, because once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. Today, it's immigration. What's next? Tomorrow, it could be something else. That's why, courts have been so cautious in the past. So when you hear headlines saying federal funding will be cut, take a breath for me and ask the next question. By what authority? Approved by who? Upheld by which court? That's what we should be asking, because in America, announcements are not law. Executive orders are, not blank checks, and the Constitution still matters. To sum it up for y'all, yes, the administration wants to cut federal funding to sanctuary cities and states. Yes, the threat is serious, but no, it's not as simple as flipping a switch. Courts have blocked similar efforts before, and we've seen that. Congress has not, authorized sweeping cuts, and the legal battle is far, far from over. And this is not just a policy fight. It's a constitutional one. And the outcome will shape the relationship between the federal government and the local communities for years to come. And, that's what you need to know. Not the talking points, not the outrage, but the actual reality behind sanctuary cities and the federal funding. So hit me up on X, y'all, if you'd like to be a guest or you have any questions, you can also hit me up on Insta or TikTok. Thank you guys for being with me. I'll have some more videos later on in the week. I'm excited, got another work week coming, but I'm always happy when I'm able to make videos and spend time with my YouTube family. Everybody be safe, you guys. Godspeed.